here with William Wayland. He is a strength and conditioning coach. He owns Powering Through Performance in Chelmsford, England. He also trains UFC fighter Arnold Allen, consults the European Tour Performance Institute. He's worked in elite sports for many, many years. The man is built like a silverback gorilla, and he also has a BJJ black belt. So welcome to the Elite Performers Club, William. Pleasure to have you on, mate.
Thanks for having me, Jack. It's a pleasure.
So for those that are listening and watching today, we're going to cover a few different topics. So firstly, combat sports, how to structure your training, common mistakes that are found in the fight game, and then golf performance, how to hit the ball further, which is something that I'm really interested in learning more about, how to maximize training efficiently, and why becoming a jacked golfer can also be a cheat code to performance, aka the Bryson DeChambeau effect. So before we cover these topics, mate, let's delve into a little bit more of your background. So what first attracted you to the health and fitness space? Were you an athlete growing up, or was it more of an acquired taste?
I've always been like a keen martial artist. I've done jiu-jitsu for a long time. I did taekwondo and kickboxing for a long time. And I think from a young age, I was always very interested. I think Bruce Lee was a big influence on me, like it is on a lot of guys. I had a copy of the Art of Expressing the Human Body, which I think was the thing that first, I think I was 16, and I had a copy of Art of Expressing the Human Body, and I poured over those training routines in there, and basically wanted to emulate one of my idols. So, like a lot of kids are doing push-ups, going for runs, doing a lot of calisthenics, stuff like that. And that's kind of what got me interested. And then that spurred my interest in sports science. And from there, I got into an applied sports science degree, and then came through that route. And then once I finished that, I was like, well, maybe I want to teach sports science. I did that for a bit, but didn't enjoy it. And I was like, no, I actually want to get out onto the field, and because I, using training myself as a jumping off point, I've always enjoyed working with others and helping develop others. Like a lot of strength and conditioning coaches, I'm an athlete who didn't quite make it in my chosen sport. So the next step is, well, how can I help other people, do better than I did, And you talk to a lot of strength and conditioning coaches, and a lot of frustrated former athletes who didn't quite make it. And so from there, I started working privately, and then I was making such an impact privately. At that point, people from NGB started getting in touch. They were interested in working with me. But it started in combat sports, and then over time, I made a slow transition into golf that started sort of slowly with a couple of athletes. But then from there, you do a good job, and people take notice, which is, a very unappreciated way of building yourself up in the field, is like providing value, doing a great job, and then people start seeing that,
Who would have thought actually doing a good job?
Who imagine that, doing a good job, and people appreciating doing it, having good service, and then from there, just I was offered a gig with Challenge Tour, which is the developmental tour for the DP World Tour, and then I've been bouncing between the two tours for a while. I'm now strength and conditioning lead on Challenge Tour, which is the developmental tour. So a lot of the guys I get to work with are going to be sort of tomorrow's, winners on the DP World Tour, and maybe go even further than that. And sort of between my work with the ETPI, obviously I was originally quite well known for my work in MMA, still working with Arnold Allen, formerly worked with Luke Barnett, worked with Corey McKenna, and a lot of guys have got to sort of high European level, Ultimate Fighter. So a lot of guys like that, and a lot of jiu-jitsu guys as well, because obviously my background is Brazilian jiu-jitsu, which I've been doing for nearly 14 years now myself. So hopefully that's a pretty decent summary of what I'm doing. And I'm just passionate about helping athletes and making sure they get a quality of care and service, that respects them, really.
Yeah, that's a really good synopsis of what you do. And I think, like you were saying, I think everyone's going, and we were talking about this before we started recording, but everyone's going down the route of, I need to be this big social media sensation. But as you've clearly demonstrated, if you do a great job locally, word gets out, and then things expand that way. And obviously you've been a testament to that. So not only starting within MMA, but then opening up into the golf avenues and being a multi-sport coach instead of I think on social media, a lot of it is like specialization of I'm the golf guy, I'm the MMA guy. So the best practitioners that I've come across have been able to apply all of their skill sets into a variety of different sports, because that just shows that they're not only just looking at it from a specialization standpoint, they've clearly got first principles when it comes to training that they can then apply to multiple sports, which I think is, it's quite rare to see in the industry, because a lot of guys are very obsessed with niching down. That's something like, obviously, being named the combat therapist, I also work with a lot of footballers and stuff like that, because I think there's limitations if you're just a single sport athlete, or single sport coach for that matter. So yeah, that's a really, I think it's just a really interesting aspect of, so we started in MMA and then we've gone to something which has, like, golf does have rotational components when it comes to training, but it is quite a different sport in the way that it's played. So in terms of your martial arts background, what are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned from your experience as a martial artist? Because I think a lot of people, they assume, I want to get in the combat sports game. It's all about fighting, violence, things of that nature. What are the biggest takeaways that you've actually gotten from your experience as a martial artist?
I guess the jiu-jitsu in particular is not a sport for the impatient, and I think that's why Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is held in high regard in general, not just for the practice of the martial art, but for the quality of patience that it instills in people.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason why, a crown prince of Abu Dhabi put the time in to get his black belt, because he can't buy that, and it means he has to be patient and actually work for something once in his life. I don't know the guy personally, but, it's a case of, you get the impression that a reason why a lot of these high achievers love Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu celebrities is because it's something they can't buy, and you can argue about, maybe people being a little bit more willing to grade them generously, but the still point is, if you were to accelerate someone within 4 years to a black belt, regardless of their celebrity status, the whole jiu-jitsu community would be up in arms. They wouldn't have it because it doesn't work that way. So it instills a real sense of patience in people, and then a lot of virtues that spiral off that, sort of discipline, greediness at times, because jiu-jitsu, it's often a sport of, like, you lose constantly, particularly in the initial stages. You're constantly tapping out, you're constantly having to stop and start again, and it instills a quality of, like, being willing to take the L and then pick up and carry on again, kind of a microcosm of doing that over and over and over. Teaches that if you really want to get good at something, you have to persevere for a long time, and in today's culture, that's something that people really struggle with. And I guess that's why jiu-jitsu, and martial arts in general, still have that old school ethos of sometimes you just have to be persistent, you have to stick at something for once in your life, and kind of try and see it through for as long as you can. And there's a beauty to jiu-jitsu once you get better, is that, like with anything, it becomes like there's a playfulness to it that you really get out of it, and then it teaches you again that when you get very, very good at something, not that I'm saying I'm any good, there are people who pace me all the time, but it teaches you that if you bring play to sort of stuff that is considered sort of arduous, I guess it's that old saying of, like, what looks like work to other people is play to you. Then that's something jiu-jitsu brings with it as well. That once you do get past blue belt, if you can make it that far, there is a playfulness and an enjoyment to it, that a physicality to it as well. That's the other thing people really enjoy about it's just something that can't be bought. And I guess that's why Mark Zuckerberg's doing it, right? Because again, there's a guy who's got all the money in the world. You can't buy Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. Like you have to work at it.
Absolutely. And I think one of the biggest barriers, I think, for people that are wanting to dabble into it would just be the uncertainty. So as someone, because I know you've also instructed a few classes at the gym that you train at yourself, what are some things that people should, basically, they're wanting to dabble into it, they're not sure how to dip their toes into it, what advice would you give to somebody like that?
I teach very occasionally. I just don't have the time. I would like to do more, but a big thing with a lot of people, like when they're starting out, is just get involved. Get involved. Do your research. Look up your gyms as well, because there are good jiu-jitsu instructors and there are less good jiu-jitsu instructors. So do your research, take a look at the club you're planning on joining. Is it structured? And don't be afraid to try multiple gyms as well and see and find a place that fits for you. That's another thing. Back in the old days, it used to be more like Fight Club. Whereas now gyms realize, well, actually, if we want to keep members and make money, it has to be a little bit more forward facing and a little bit more customer friendly. You've got desk workers and other people who can't go in with dislocated fingers and busted noses and cauliflower ears. As cool as that might look to some people, but you've got to take care of yourself physically. And going in a gym that's like hard knocks 100% of the time, A, it's not going to be profitable for the gym, and B, you're not going to want to stay there. Yes, sometimes you have to take your lumps, but you work up to that point, that's historically always been kind of a fraught issue in jiu-jitsu is this battle between, it has to be hard to teach you things and teach you how to deal with live opponents and how to overcome a resisting opposition. On the other hand, you've got people perhaps in their late 30s, 40s taking up for the first time. Unless they want to keep their therapist very physical therapist very busy, their physio very busy. These guys have to be kind of looked after just a little bit, at the same time, you've got to strike that balance between, building toughness as well. But just get stuck in is my advice, but don't be afraid to shop around.
Yeah. I think you got to find the gym that suits your personality as well. And that's the best thing is like trying a few different places, and not everyone wants to have a fight. Like from a striking standpoint, there's guys that just want to light spar, and that's completely fine. So I think, that's a huge component is like, if you don't feel comfortable in the place that you're planning on training, there are other options that may be more friendly for what your goals are. Because I think there's a lot of upsides, even just from like the movement qualities of those sports. Even if you never endeavor to fight ever in your life, just even as an example with striking, like getting getting some semblance of power and plyometrics training into a typical training routine that is usually your slow tempo bodybuilding style stuff, like adding that plus your more bro split kind of bodybuilding is a great blend between getting your conditioning and actually training the heart, which I think a lot of younger guys that are super hypertrophy obsessed probably lack a little bit. There's just so many upsides and so many things that you can actually get out of combat sports, even if you never want to have a fight, which I think is probably under discussed a lot, which is what I'm trying to bring to the forefront as well.
Yeah. Well, most people don't want to fight. Most people probably don't even want to compete, which is the other thing. And some jiu-jitsu gyms are very competition focused, and that's fine. There's a place for that. But you got to remember, your average hobbyist, we're talking, I don't know, maybe 80-90% of people are probably never going to compete. Yeah, they'll spar. I don't enjoy competition so much anymore. I used to. I went through that phase of like I had to compete all the time. But now as I've gotten older, it's just finding the time to even just get to training sometimes is really difficult, and you've just got to respect that. But even from I joke now that jiu-jitsu is my cardio. So like most of the time I go for more of a bit of a workout of both my brain and my body. So and then try and marry that with all the other stuff you've probably seen me doing. So it's like walking quite a fine line, really.
Yeah. 100%. I think that blends beautifully into discussing, because it's my understanding you've worked with Arnold Allen for quite some time. So you've been able to actually not just work with him for a very short period and then say, oh, I've worked with a UFC fighter. You've actually helped him develop into the athlete that he is today. What were some of the biggest qualities that you saw in him, even as a youngster, that you think's made him one of the best fighters on the planet?
So I've been working with Arnold for like nearly 10 years. And when he first walked in the gym, he obviously had a lot of natural physical strength, which was very apparent. You can see it based on his family history. Like his brother is a strong man, his dad was a strong man, and Arnold came in with a phenotype that if he were to go a different direction, he could probably do those types of sports. Even though he's what 5'11", so he's not super tall, but you can see there's definitely this phenotype of his that borrowed definitely towards being stronger, being way more explosive than most people. But the other thing that if you listen to Arnold and actually take the time to listen to like when he speaks and stuff and does interviews and things, there's a humility there and a willingness to learn. He came up in a period where obviously the brash, talkative fighter was very in vogue, which I think might have hampered him a little bit from a self-promotion standpoint. But now people have kind of cottoned on to this sort of wry, very English, self-depreciating sort of sense of humor that he has. And that definitely stems into his approach to combat sports. He's willing to listen. He doesn't take himself too seriously. He's not hyper intense like a lot of these guys. And that then helps him because there's no ego. He's then very willing to take on people's advice, listen, seek help as needed, and it's kind of those qualities, that plasticity of thinking, and then also his laid backness, but also this, this natural physicality that then borrows, lends it to itself very well to what he does as an athlete. So those things all combine to make him sort of, pretty successful. You think about it, he's still ranked in the top 10, in his weight class, and he came very close to top 3 at one point. So, there's still a lot more to come out of that guy.
Absolutely. And I think a common thing that a lot of fighters talk about is like injury minimization. As someone who is physically preparing their athletes, along with obviously the skill acquisition side and the fight camps that they're doing, what are some general things that you are looking to integrate? Obviously, load management being one of those things. What are you sort of thinking about when it comes to, because I hate the bulletproofing analogies, all of that stuff. How do you go about from a first principles or macro standpoint to minimize the chances of injuries occurring?
So big thing I always talk about is this concept of via negativa, like what can we take away before we think about even adding stuff. So when it comes to physical training, what's the minimum I can get away with in terms of applying load or volume to this guy? So what we kind of settled on in the long run, for instance, just taking Arnold as an example, is a high intensity, low volume approach to his training. We only really lift like twice a week, but it's quite high intensity. We're talking sort of pretty high percentages of 1 RM. And then, the frequency is pretty sort of moderate as well. And the volumes are pretty low. Volume is what will get you if you're a combat sports athlete. Volume is the absolute #1 killer for these guys. And what I think Arnold appreciates now, and what a lot of progressive coaches like a Faris Sahabi, for instance, is that it's always about quality over quantity all the time. There's historically combat sports have always been a volume-based approach to conditioning. I think it's tied into this concept of mental toughness, which is problematic. So it perhaps borrows from, say, wrestling and boxing, and where MMA has perhaps been more progressive is that they've moved away from these high volume, high intensity, mixed approaches that really only just weed out people who can't adapt to that type of training. Whereas MMA, because from the get-go, they have so much on their plate from a skill acquisition, physical training standpoint, they have to stop and say, wait a minute, what can we do less of? Because otherwise we're just going to break. Because so many MMA fighters break in camp. And the UFC PI has data to support this, that most non-contact injuries always occur in the 8 weeks before camp. Fights have been delayed and cards have been destroyed by like ACL tears, shoulder issues. You've seen it, and quite often it's like, what is this injury plague that's hitting people in the 8 weeks before fights? And it's because usually they're just tipping the scales far too much in one direction, if that makes sense. And that's the real big problem. So the big question is, what can we do less of? And then and then what we do have left, how can we intensify that?
Yeah. So would you say that the volume, so let's say like a beginner coach that is wanting to dabble in to working with fighting athletes, would you say volume is because I've seen that as well, like the typical, they still give them like a 5x5 and that just cooks their CNS and they've got all these other things to do. What do you think are the common mistakes that coaches that are trying to take on, or what are the things that coaches should avoid when it comes to taking on a fighting athlete and understanding what they need compared to a different athlete?
So a big problem is attachment to a particular method or way of training. So let's say if we get prescriptive, let's say someone really likes a 5x5 method that they might have picked up online, they've used it themselves, it works well for themselves. They then use that as a frame within which they train everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And the unwillingness to say, well, wait a minute, for this particular athlete, maybe let's just take the example of 5x5. Maybe 5x5 isn't the right fit for this guy. Why not 5x3 or 5x2? Keeping the intensity the same, but dropping the volume down. Now, the coach is perhaps very much in love with a particular approach or method. They lack the flexibility to be able to turn around, or the confidence even, to turn around and go, no, this method is not for this particular client. I perhaps need to make changes or alter things. So, people become very attached to particular methods. For instance, a lot of argument about, different approaches. Does it have to be conjugate? Does it have to be triphasic? Does it have to be this? Does it have to be that? And their attachment to this method means they'll try and fit that square peg in a round hole, and force it in if they have to. Through the athlete, it's I have to have my method work. And this is a big part of the problem. And so a lot of young coaches lack confidence, but you eventually do it enough times that you build a reflexiveness when it comes to building programs for athletes you've been working for a while. And then the other thing is, do not be afraid to talk to the athlete and learn what they prefer. What things do they like to do? What do they not like to do? For instance, a good example that I've cited a few times, just using Arnold as an easy example, we don't bench press him, not in camp. We do mainly push presses and push press variations. We do not bench press him. He does not like the way it makes him feel. He doesn't like the way it makes him feel when he hits pads. Out of that, we will do bench press. But in camp, I'll listen to him and perhaps exclude exercises he feels that aren't very, very useful. I don't have the ego of where you have to bench press. What are you talking about? You absolutely have to do it. It's not like that. It's like, look, what do you feel works for you? What is kind of congruent with our aims? And then we will make exercise selections based on that process, for instance. And that comes with working with someone for a long time, having confidence that they know what they're talking about, having confidence that you know what you're talking about. But that's where a lot of the mistakes come from early in a trainer's career, is usually fear, because they don't want the athlete to not like what they're doing. At the same time, having a method or a dogma to stick to helps with people deal with that uncertainty, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, he's a fighting athlete. We're not trying to join a powerlifting meet and win that. So long as it gets the general job done of what we're wanting to get done, that's the most important thing. So I think another interesting question I have for you is, on an opposite coin, let's say somebody's wanting to, or they're in their like mid 20s, late 20s, even 30s, and they're wanting to get involved in, we'll go with both striking and grappling if you wanted to answer those separately, but what are some of the things they can be doing in the gym to basically forge or prepare their body for the demands of doing something like that if they've never been exposed to grappling positions as well as striking based loads?
Yeah. So, a lot of people, it's barely even talked about anymore. Do you remember the old concept of like anatomical adaptation phases?
Mm-hmm.
So it's the very, very old school idea that athletes, before they engage in like strength training, or any sort of thing intensive, they run through an anatomical adaptation phase. I guess it's been kind of merged into GPP now. And for normal people, it's like, well, and this is something I like from Dan John, is everyone likes to think they're elite, right? So you'll get a guy who's perhaps like, he does a bit of boxing, he maybe does some jiu-jitsu, he's like, okay, I want to add some strength training. His initial gut reaction is to go, well, what are the best guys doing? I need to emulate that. And it's like, whoa, slow down. You're running before you can walk. When was the last time you set foot in a gym for a start and lifted any weights? You might have to eat some humble pie and scale everything back to, are you good at the basic movement patterns? Can you squat, push, pull, hinge? Can you brace? How well do you locomote? Can you run pretty good? Little simple things like that people just ignore. Their instant reaction is to go, well, I'm going to do whatever the best guys are doing. And then they jump onto Instagram before they know it, they're down a rabbit hole doing all sorts of silly stuff. You have to scale that way back. There's an argument to be made for just like well-rounded, very basic training, just to get you started at the beginning. Then you can look to complexify it later. But initially, it has to be, pretty simplistic. Some of my go-tos, for instance, for guys who've just literally walked in, they come over from the jiu-jitsu gym. The jiu-jitsu gym happens to be just across the road from me. They come in, they go, I want to start strength and conditioning. Their instant reaction is like, oh, I want to do X, Y, and Z that I've seen. It's like, no, we're going to start, boring stuff, push-ups, goblet squats, ring rows, hinges, nothing fancy. And quite often you find ways to intensify that to make them feel like they're working hard, but at the same time you're feeding them the very basics that they need, because people always want to jump way ahead. Some of these guys have never touched a barbell, they have no understanding of the barbell lifts, and they wind up quarter squatting or doing crappy reps, and the quality of their movement isn't there. I always say that, much like with martial arts, you didn't start with your flying berimbolos or omoplatas and all this type of stuff when you set on the mat. When you went on the mats for the first time, it wasn't like that. Why would you do the same in the gym? You have to start with the fundamentals, and it's that willingness to perhaps put your ego aside and dial in on the fundamentals. But again, most people, they'll look up some guru or something, find a training program, try and follow that, and then it's kind of sink or swim for them. And sadly, a lot of the time, it's quite often sink, and the drop off's is there. They just drop out.
Mm-hmm. And if you were someone, let's say you've been bodybuilding for years and years and years, would there be any tweaks that you would make to that protocol if someone was like, all right, well, I've started my Muay Thai, I've started my Jiu-Jitsu, what tweaks can I make with my current bodybuilding split that I'm doing to better prepare me for those specific endeavors? So it's kind of like the flip side of what you just covered there.
Yeah, so in that case, it's usually these guys are quite volume addicted. So they like the pump, they like the feeling of soreness. Quite often those are things that they recognize with successful training. So what you have to get their head around is quite often squash the volume. And particularly if they're doing a lot of like low body work, you squashing the volume and low body work makes a big difference for most of these guys. So get them rethink their low body training, more of a strength focused, lower volume. Now, when it comes to upper body training, particularly if they're a bit of a gym bro, they've done a lot of upper body work. It's no secret that these people like bench press an awful lot. That can be problematic because of the structural changes that begin to come in from like bench pressing an awful lot. Bench pressing can be quite problematic sometimes for these guys. I'm not against bench press. I like bench pressing myself, but you do see limitations in shoulder mobility, issues with certain positions of jiu-jitsu. You get people into done a lot of bench pressing, they suddenly turn up to jiu-jitsu. I can guarantee you those are the guys that are going to suffer rotator cuff tears when it comes to practicing kimuras or shoulder locks, stuff like that, because they don't have the passive flexibility in their shoulders that perhaps they should do. So this is where I encourage guys like that to really focus on full ROM exercises, perhaps add in some stuff to help with the rotator cuff, work on your internal external rotation of the shoulder. The internal external rotation of the shoulder and internal and external rotation of the hip are the two greatest sort of mobility qualities that you can have for jiu-jitsu. And a lot of these guys coming in, having done like maybe bodybuilding type routine for a long time, those deficiencies show up very, very fast, and it causes them lots of problems. And that's when they end up with people like you, because their shoulders are messed up, because they lack the external rotation or the internal rotation. Someone's just put them in a position, they're perhaps tapped a little bit too late, bang. Suddenly they've got, a persistent shoulder problem that hurts when they bench, and suddenly they're like, well, they have a hard time sort of squaring that and then having perhaps dial things back because they're used to training at a certain intensity. It comes with a whole cascade of problems there from the top of that. So yeah, and the other thing would be, just squash that volume, increase the intensity, and then just shoulder care, hip care are the two then biggest things you need to focus on. Same with striking athletes. And then the third concern I would say would be these guys panic about their conditioning. Because generally their energy systems are not perhaps trained in a way that's been favorable for a long time. These are the guys who gas out after a couple of rounds, sparring and stuff, and they lack any real sort of base aerobic conditioning component, so they just can't clear waste product buildup. They get very, very tired, and that's perhaps where getting them out of the idea that cardio won't kill their gains perhaps might be a good idea. Yes. And the thing is, building a base level of aerobic conditioning, it's not hard. It's a little bit tedious, but if you just commit to it for a little while, and the thing is, the threshold isn't an awful lot. You don't have to do a ton. Just getting out and sparring as well will help with your conditioning, but it's when you have to then put your foot down and hit fifth gear, these guys struggle because they perhaps lack the ability to to recover appropriately from those, and you see it when guys suddenly go on a bit of a push, they'll suddenly increase their strike rate, or they'll suddenly pick up on the mats. They've got a couple of minutes in them, and then they're done. And it's because they're just baseline conditioning is just not there. So don't be afraid to do a little bit of like aerobic conditioning. It's not going to destroy your gains. We've seen that now. There's been a big surge of like zone 2 popularity online. There's a good reason for that. It was about time it came back around. Again, perhaps people pushing that too hard now. But, there's nothing wrong with, and I remember old videos of like the old school bodybuilders doing like long, walks on treadmills and stuff. I think I even remember like Ronnie Coleman, guys like that, all did cardio as part of their routine. You see them doing stuff like that. And it's like, why do people stop? And I think it's because this narrative came along that cardio would destroy any gains. And I do remember a lot of the old school guys doing they used to call it, they used to do it for their fat loss, right? So they used to do it for their cutting phases. You see them on the Stairmaster, doing the Stairmaster 40 minutes fasted, perhaps not the best thing if you're an elite athlete, but their purpose was, you're still getting aerobic conditioning. People don't appreciate that. Obviously, the bodybuilder's main focus is that, I'm getting shredded. What they don't realize they're doing is perhaps getting a decent sort of aerobic conditioning effect from that as well, So, yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's very well answered. That takes me to one of probably something that you and I talk about a lot is how does somebody who doesn't have a ton of exercise literacy in terms of understanding, because there's so many different exercise gimmicks online now, how do you actually shovel through all of the shit and find, because there's like, I see the common mistake a lot of people make is they think if it looks like the sport and it's in the gym, then it's probably going to be more beneficial to like it's Muay Thai specific, it's boxing specific. What advice would you give somebody who isn't necessarily doing this 24/7 like you and I, so we can kind of filter what's good and what's not? What advice would you give to somebody to actually find what works and what is basically bullshit in the industry?
Yeah, so there's a real problem with I don't know if it's schools are failing people or what, but like critical thinking seems to have just become a quality that's not appreciated anymore. And the idea that I always like the idea if it can I swear? Is that okay? So if it looks like shit, it probably is shit. Is the first thing, and then the other thing is take a moment to critically evaluate what you're looking at. If it is too good to be true, it probably is. So if someone is being, is approaching you with a dichotomy that's like, very simple idea that this one particular exercise or these 3 particular exercises will improve your performance, that is a too good to be true statement, because dichotomies and simplistic, ways of approaching problems, they communicate well. Because I have a problem, I want a solution. Do this drill to improve your swing, for instance. Do this drill to improve your punching power. Simple statements that people then cotton onto. The problem is complexity, which is how sports performance really works, is a bad communicator. Because there's so much going on, and trying to communicate the complexity of sports performance in a 30-second, minute-long video is nearly impossible, because there's so much nuance going on within that. And again, it's that idea of perhaps take a moment, consider, is it too good to be true? Which it probably is. One weird fix, one weird trick, do these 3 drills. All of these, very simplistic statements quite often are the lead in to try and get you to pay attention to what's coming next. And that's where people get tripped up. And you've got to remember that most people, particularly when it comes to like, and some of the worst people for it, actually sometimes pretty smart people who have domain expertise in one area, and then they think that they're smart enough to not be tricked by this type of stuff in other areas. So I meet very talented combat athletes, very talented golfers who are excellent at their own sport, but then when it comes to their adjacencies, they think they have the competency to be able to sniff out this stuff, but quite often they're the guys who fall for it straight away, which is a bit of an issue. So yeah, it's just, have that toolkit in your mind of just like, is it too good to be true? If it looks like bullshit, it's probably bullshit. And having those 2 things when it comes to browsing social media is, can come in awfully handy for helping you sniff out sort of what's going to work, what's not, because the reality is always both complex and sometimes more simplistic than we imagined. Again, most people think they're elite. They're not. You know, a particular drill might make a small change for other people. And then the other thing people need to figure out is like what we call something we've applied with the European Tour Performance Institute is this concept of probability of impact pyramid. And the idea is that the biggest influence exercise can probably make is on general qualities. The idea that it will make a difference from a technical standpoint doesn't exist, or makes very, very little impact. So at the base of this pyramid, you've got your general physical training. The chance that a strength and conditioning exercise is going to make a difference at the very tip top is not going to happen. And selling people on that, unfortunately, is far too easy.
Yeah, you're right, and it's easy to get clicks on that kind of stuff as well, and that's why I am trying to get as many guys like yourself on these kinds of conversations, because I think I'm the guy on Twitter now that is always posting, and the problem is that you've got really high level athletes doing stuff as well as celebrity athletes like your Jake Pauls. I saw a Jake Paul kettlebell swing the other week, and I was like, even Mike Tyson with his med ball throws, like his legs are super wide, knees are valgusing when he's doing overhead throws, doesn't have the shoulder mobility to even be doing it. And then it's funny because then they're like, oh, well, he's Mike Tyson. What the fuck do you know, basically? But yeah, I think that's a big reason why I'm wanting to have as many conversations like this as possible to actually push people in the right direction because it's just too easy to get caught in the trap of trying to do stuff. You think it's doing something, but you're actually, if anything, you're better off not even wasting your time doing it in the first place. And I think that's a good segue into golf. What are the common things that you've seen, even athletes at a high level? What's hot in terms of exercise modalities that a lot of people are doing that are potentially, in your opinion, a more or less a waste of time?
So a big problem in golf strength and conditioning, I'm going to call it that because it's known as golf fitness, which I feel is a misnomer. It doesn't make any sense. Why is it golf fitness for golf and not, but it's strength and conditioning for everything else? And golf has a real sense of like golf is different somehow. Golf is special. It requires specialized approaches to physical training, which we're now learning just isn't true. The biggest predictor of your performance in golf is probably how much power you produce in a jump. Which if you said that 10, 15, 20 years ago, people were going, no, what are you talking about? Golf's all about finesse and technique. Turns out, if you can throw up a decent jump, you learn to play golf well, you'll probably be able to hit it pretty far. So, which is why all our modalities now, the guys who are good, are shifting towards a very jump-focused physical training approach. Now, the big focus in golf that's very disconcerting is because it's always historically been very physio-led, very medical-led, means that there's a real trend for underloading and overcomplicating exercise selection. A big problem that I've spoken about is this willingness to combine multiple things together. So you might take a split squat, for instance, rather than just doing a regular dumbbell split squat or a barbell split squat. No, that's not enough. We need to add rotation to that to make it more golf specific. So now what you're doing, instead of doing one thing well, you're doing two things badly, which seems to be a real trend in golf fitness. I see it sometimes in combat sports too. Is this willingness to combine exercises. And then when you combine exercises together, what you do is you get a loss of intensity because you're trying to do two things rather than just one thing. At the end of the day, we're training gross physical qualities. The moment we start adding too much movement complexity, those gross physical qualities go out the window, and we start training a new motor skill or just a new skill in general, because it's hard to balance and twist and stuff all at the same time. So you end up doing that just for the sake of itself, if that makes sense. So by doing your lunge with a twist, you get good at lunging and twisting. You don't either strengthen your legs or build up as your strength or power in rotation. You're just doing two things badly. And then the other issue in golf, it's just that medicalization means that because physio's kind of led the charge in golf, and we had a study come out just the other day showing that 50% of golfers will experience an MSK injury, at some point in their lifetime. The first people they run to, because most golfers don't do much physical training, is they'll go see a physiotherapist. Physiotherapist then prescribes them a course of treatment. Usually, hopefully they get rehabbed out of the injury. The golfer then goes, well, I don't want that to happen again. Can you help me out with my general physical training? Well, I respect and love physiotherapists, but they're not strength and conditioning coaches. So they prescribe in a fashion that's generally rehabilitative and underloaded. So they're not performance practitioners, they're rehabilitation practitioners or injury prevention practitioners. There's a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where golf historically, from a physical training standpoint, because it's had this medical patient-first approach, you can't treat athletes like patients. That means you'll never push them. You have to treat them like performers. And that's where the change in golf has really come this past 5 or sort of 10 years, is we're now moving to a performance-oriented model rather than a patient-oriented model, which is where golf has been historically, which is why golf feels like it's very late to the party. And you join any Twitter thread where an elite golfer posts their physical training, you can guarantee there's going to be a lot of comments about how they're going to get hurt, because this fragility mindset is very, very persistent. Combat athletes, they can get away with all sorts. Yeah, you might see Tony Ferguson doing some random crazy stuff that might get him hurt. But the comments are just always like, yeah, this is kind of random, this is kind of crazy. But no one ever questions that he might get hurt doing that. Whereas with golfers, it's people doing simple stuff like deadlifts or squats or bench presses, and oh, you don't want to do that, I hurt my back doing that. Or like the commentary from the recreational golf field is always kind of amusing to sift through, because there's this hypervigilance, this worry. Whereas combat athletes are different, that they're quite willing to throw themselves into the grinder and hope for the best. There's a completely different ethos. And that's one thing I've noticed between the two sports, is that, and I've always said this, golf physical training is quite often overly complex and underloaded, whereas MMA's physical training is quite often very simplistic and overloaded. So there'll be the guys doing hundreds of push-ups. There'll be the guys doing 8K runs every single day. There'll be the guys doing skipping and doing all very simple stuff, but just done way too high volumes, way too hard. Whereas golf's the other way around. The exercises are very complicated, quite showy, but very, very underloaded. So there's nothing meaningful really happening in terms of trying to make a meaningful change, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. And that was something I recognized probably in my first 3 to 6 months of being a physiotherapist, was the fact that unless you're willing to learn more about the strength and conditioning side, you are going to be underloading them, because it's like a glute clamshell or a banded rotator cuff exercise can only do so much until you actually need, especially if someone's has high performance goals. Obviously, from a purely rehab standpoint, if you want to go back to typing, it's very different to wanting to throw a punch or get put into a very, very vulnerable position. I think there's still a big gap, but I think now even your facility, as an example, it has physiotherapists there and S&C guys. People are starting to finally work together, which I think it was like people thought that they were taking from one another's pockets, whereas now I feel like to actually have a good facility, you need to have a good team on hand, because there's things that the rehab side will do better than S&C guys, and vice versa. It's very hard to do both at a very, very high level, especially if you're working with guys that have millions of dollars on the line in order to perform at their highest level, similar to like golf being a prime example of that. So I think the next thing I'd like to discuss, obviously you said vertical jump performance is a good predictor of how far you can hit the ball. When you are working with an athlete, what are the general, if I was to ask you, all right, Will, I want to hit the ball as far as I possibly can, what are the things I need to work on in order to establish the longest yardage that I can possibly muster?
Yeah, so I've got a good answer to this question, and I'm in the privileged position that one of my clients is the current European long drive champion. So I've learned an awful lot about how to push, in fact, chase that singular quality of how far we can hit it, and then working in an empirical fashion to try and figure out how we get there. And we know that a base of physical strength is very, very important, and particularly low body strength. But then the two physical qualities that seem to be very, very important for hitting the ball very, very far are how much impulse or jump impulse you produce, which is how much force you produce per second in your jumps. Not necessarily jump height. People come in all shapes and sizes. We're not interested in dunking. That's not the purpose here. We just want to produce as much force as quickly as possible, in our legs. And that's a really big predictor. The other thing is upper body explosive power, which a lot of people were very surprised in golf. we build strength to a certain point, but then what we do is I start putting a big focus on med ball throws, ballistic push-ups, push presses, this type of stuff. So upper body explosive power seems to be another key predictor of club head speed. What's interesting is that mobility and flexibility are not good predictors of club head speed, which throws a lot of people, because historically, a lot of elite golfers, provided you can hit the ball and make the shapes you need to make, you don't need to be any more flexible than that.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where the problem with chasing that tail becomes a problem, is where you just start doing flexibility and mobility work for mobility's sake. And if you take that too far, it even may have a net negative effect, because you become too pliable, right? You lack the requisite stiffness and elasticity, because you train it out of yourself by just stretching and mobilizing. And that's an unforeseen consequence of this sort of mobility is king type of attitude. And don't get me wrong, you want to be able to make the shapes you can make. You need to be pain free. But if you can do that and not compromise your some of your other physical qualities, because it's a seesaw, right? That's surprised a lot of people that the flexibility and mobility are not good predictors of club head speed. So, and this concept of club head speed, again, chasing that, what we see is, like, if someone's got good high club head speed, the distances will go up. If you're hitting for greater distances, you'll probably end up winning more prize money. That's the game that's being played in golf at the moment. That's why Bryson appeared and did what he did. And that's the other thing. Obviously, physics plays a big part in the golf swing. If you do carry more mass, you'll be able to preserve more angular momentum. And that plays a big part as well. So if you gain a little bit of muscle mass, it's generally not going to hurt your golf performance. In fact, it might well improve it. And obviously, having that little bit of muscle mass makes you more robust. If you're a little bit more robust, you're going to be more available. You can play more. You're going to be injured less. Going back to that, what we talked about earlier, about 50% of all golfers suffer an MSK issue. We know that and for golf, 80% of all injuries in golf are overuse. Too much golf is what's hurting most golfers. And we can reduce overuse injuries by nearly 50% if we do a well-structured strength and conditioning program. So not just from an empirical standpoint, the evidence also is now supporting what we're doing as well from a sort of systematic review standpoint as well. So, this is dual-pronged approach of what's transforming golf performance at the moment. Is the fact that we've applied the training, we've seen the changes, and then also the evidence now seems to be catching up with what we're doing.
Yeah, excellent. And do you think the younger athletes of today at the moment will be hitting the ball even further now that it is starting to have that transition into more of not just a skillful golfer, but also like your Bryson, like a jacked, strong, violently capable of violent rotation? Do you see the yardages getting even larger and larger over the next 20, 30 years?
There's a good golf researcher called Alex Elhurt, and he actually posted something just the other day. Sorry if I butchered your last name, Alex, but he posted an image showing that average club head speeds have been increasing since 2008, and there is a cohort of younger golfers coming through now who are training in NGBs. Like, I work with England Golf, for instance, so I'm a strength and conditioning coach with England Golf, and the juniors now, even over the past few years, are now hitting it further, have higher club head speeds than their peers just a few years ago. So there's a whole cohort of youth golfers, many of whom go to the US to play US college golf, who are coming through, that are bigger, stronger, and faster than they've ever been. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few years, because there's a potential equipment rollback coming, where they're going to try and change maybe the balls or the clubs, or one or other, or both, to try and kill distance a little bit, because there's this idea that it's perhaps harming the game, making it less accessible. But I'm of the opinion that these guys are all playing against each other and playing against the courses they're on. I'm all for more speed. I like it. But there's a lot of recreational golfers who obviously struggle to get around the same courses because they hit it so much shorter. And that's the one thing that's interesting in golf, is that obviously you've got not just a tiny number of professionals playing. There's a mass of recreational amateur golfers who also play the same courses. And because courses are being built for championships in mind, the courses are now getting very, very long, and amateur recreational golfers struggling. So that's why they're looking to maybe reform things a little bit, make the pro game a little bit different, because these guys are now hitting it so far.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's no surprise, because I think, as you were saying, it has finally shifted away from being more of a remedial exercise prescription for what these guys are doing, and they're actually training like true athletes. And I think even you saw that with Tiger Woods, the difference in yardage that he had as just being like and he was someone that was hitting the gym, which you didn't see many other people in his time doing that. And the results showed for it. He was just smashing bombs compared to everybody else on tour. So yeah, it's exciting to see that as well, because I think I'm seeing a lot more younger golfers on the courses now, and I think that is because it is turning into more of a athletic performance based sport versus just the skill acquisition. Oh, you need to be it's like a retirement age sport to play. There's a ton of young guys that are playing even recreationally, which is, I think, is really good for the sport as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that a violent rotation sport would be the choice for a retiree, right? Like it's and then they end up making their chiropractor or their physio or their osteopath very wealthy, because it's like, well, I've retired, I'll just start playing golf 3 times a week. Why does my back hurt? And it's like, well, you've decided to pick up a sport that's requires a lot of rotation, something you've probably not done for a very long time, and now you wonder why your back's crumbling. So I always find that sort of slightly ironic. But yeah, there's a cohort of like these robust, athletic young guys coming through, and they're just going to keep increasing in number, and the nature of the sport is going to change, over time. It's already starting to.
Yeah, excellent. Are these sorts of concepts inside your Stoic Golfer's Manual?
So the Stoic Golfer's Manual has actually come out of a weird a confluence of conversations I was having. Because here's the thing: with pro golf or amateur golf at a very high level, it's mentally a very, very challenging sport. And like I've been a big fan of Stoic philosophy for a long time, and quite often I some of the things you pick up and you just spit them out like aphorisms and stuff, and little things you've learned from quotes and stuff that you'll just repeat sometimes. And some of the golfers are like, I'll talk about things like the basic concept of worrying about what you control, don't worry about what you cannot control. And some guys that really resonates. I'm finding that idea very, very useful. Where did you hear about that? And then I'll talk about them like, reading meditations or Seneca or stuff like that. And they'll be like, well, I can't be bothered to read that. Is there anything for like, golf? And sometimes they don't have the patience to read like, mindset training or psych manuals for golf, which exist. There's good stuff out there for that type of thing. It's just a little bit heavy going. So if they want something they can kind of pick up and put down, that's why, it was a weird ad hoc to what I'm already doing. I thought, well, I'll sit down. I'll try and distill some of the concept of Stoicism into a way that golfers can use it when they're on the course. And that's where that was born from. So very different from me, because historically I've written like training programs and stuff more into strength training manuals or peer review or stuff like that. And this time around it was a case of, well, I'll try something different, a little bit of mindset type stuff. It's not a self-help manual or anything like that. It's just basically, look, how can you look at the game critically in a fashion that's sort of dispassionate, that means that you're not beating yourself up at the end of the round, or you go to the driving range and hit 200 balls because you're pissed because you played poorly, So just taking stock of things and then, coming back and approaching each day like it's another chance to do well,
Yeah. And I think that's the mental side of golf is just, you see someone have an best round of their life. They come back tomorrow, have the worst round of their life. There's not many other sports I feel like you can have that disparity in performance one day after the other because of the level of skill that is involved, and you can just get into massive slumps. So even having mental models or even just a whole philosophy around thinking about your performance is huge, because I think the mental side is probably one of the most interesting. I don't really watch team sports. I'm also focus on the actual athlete and analyze how they think, because I always find that incredibly interesting. How long have you dabbled into the philosophies of Stoicism? Has this been something that you've been exploring for a long time, or?
Yeah, it's something that's interested me, I'd say for nearly sort of 9, 10 years. It's helped me with my own mental health issues in the past. So, I always found the philosophy sort of, useful, because you realize that people, even those, I know it's an ancient philosophy, but and I've said this before, that when you read, say, meditations, and you realize that the emperor of the Roman Empire is dealing with some of the same difficulties that you are, the uncertainties, the anxieties, things like that. It's like, well, wait a minute. If this guy who is supposed to be one of the most powerful historic people in the world is suffering from the same sort of uncertainties you are, then maybe things aren't so bad, and then maybe there's something I can learn from his lessons that I can apply to my own life. And that's why I've always found it very, very useful in that regard. Particularly if you're someone like me, who I have a hard time with uncertainty. I have a hard time, historically always sort of wanting to be in control of my situation. And you sometimes just have to learn to let that stuff go. There are some things you can't influence, some things you can't control. And I think that's maybe why I didn't make a great athlete myself, because, sport is all about uncertainty. And if you're someone who doesn't tolerate that very well, I used to get bad comp anxiety, stuff like that. Perhaps I could have done with something like this back when I was competing. But it was only kind of only with the benefit of hindsight, right? That you look back and you go, oh yeah, I was worrying like unnecessarily about weight cuts and, what my opposition was doing and, what time of day the comp was or where it was or stuff like that, it's completely out of your hands. So why worry about that stuff,
Yeah.
And that's kind of, that's where that base principle of Stoic philosophy is the idea that what is within your power to control, focus on those things or on the essentials, and then the things that are not within your control, well, you've just got to let them go,
Yeah, and that's something that I'm striving to get better at as well. And it's like I think anyone who has high expectations of what they want to achieve are always more inclined to be that way. So yeah, I've met so many people that are similar to yourself and like myself as well, who, because their expectations are so high, they want to control as many variables as possible. But sometimes you get in the way of yourself as well when you're trying to do those things. So it's really interesting. So in terms of where can people find you? Where's the best place to contact you? Are you taking any athletes on currently, or do you have any offerings that athletes could look into more if they're wanting to learn about more about your work?
Yeah, so I'm always open to correspondence. There is a vetting process, so I'm always happy to work with athletes via correspondence if need be, or in person. I do vet because obviously time limited with all my obligations, but I'm happy to work with people. My DMs on Twitter are always open, and I'm always happy to see if someone's a good fit or not. So always happy for that. And I'm not one of these people who make myself totally inaccessible. I'm willing to have a conversation with most people, and some of those guys have just reached out over time. Some of them I consider friends now. So I'm always willing to have a conversation with people. If that's not something for you, however, I do offer a couple of different bundles of I've been running programs for a long time. So I took the effort to bundle some of them together into both a strength and conditioning bundle that's just just general strength and conditioning, general athlete physical preparation that can be applied to just about any sport. And then I've written a whole bunch of golf programs over the years. I've bundled those together as well. So we have a golf performance bundle as well. I think that's 40 weeks of programming. If you're a golfer that perhaps you want to follow a program kind of on your own initiative and run it that way, you can follow those two. So those two bundles are sort of my main online offering. There's that Stoic Golfer's Manual as well. I do offer some subscription-based programs that are sort of pretty popular through Train Heroic. If that's something you want, to an app. Some people like PDFs, some people like apps. So I try and offer both. A lot of golfers are kind of old school, so they like PDFs. They like to be able to print stuff out, So some guys do dig that, whereas a lot of the younger guys, they prefer to have an app where everything's kind of just delivered to them on their phone. Not that I'm pro phones in gyms, but it's the way things are now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll put all of those links in the description to this discussion as well. But yeah, I really appreciate your time today, mate. I'm sure anyone listening to this will take a bunch out of the discussion that we had. That's why I wanted to have it a little bit more centered around the athlete. I know a lot of the time coaches want to talk about training stuff, but I think, even just some of the mistakes that both combat sport athletes and golfers make, if they take one or two things from the discussion with someone who's doing it at the highest levels, I think they're going to be in a much better position. So really appreciate your time, mate.
No worries. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Awesome.